Global Engagement with Religion, part of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. Welcome to all of you who are here in person and to our viewers online. Tonight's program is part of this year's Notre Dame Forum on the Future of Democracy. We're delighted to partner with Notre Dame Forum to celebrate the Nasr Book Prize. Last year, the Nasr Prize honored Tyson Yunkaporta, an Aboriginal author from Australia, for his remarkable book, Say and Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. This year, we are honoring Anthony Annett for his courageous book, Cathonomics: How Catholic Tradition Can Create a More Just Economy, published by Georgetown University Press in 2022. You know a book is going to have impact when one reviewer writes, "Why Cathonomics is neither Catholic nor economic." And another reviewer argues, Annett's Cathonomics should be required reading in business schools. Dr. Annett, we call him Tony, is trained as an economist with decades of experience in the IMF, and he is a devout Catholic. He works closely with Religions for Peace and serves as an advisor to Columbia University's Earth Institute, leading its initiative to strengthen the engagement of the world's religious communities in the climate change and sustainable development agenda. Earlier today, scholars representing the world's diverse traditions of religion and wisdom, Hindu, Chinese, Jewish, Buddhist, Catholic, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Baha'i, and modern science, have been engaged in dialogue, responding to the ideas presented in Cathonomics from their own perspectives. Thus, this multi-faith symposium aims to find points of agreement and disagreement, resonance and dissonance, to see different worlds and together to imagine new ones. Global civilization is breaking down. Progress has been breathtaking, but planetary boundaries have been transgressed. There is a crisis in our inner and outer worlds. The external deserts in the world are growing, reminds us Laudato Si, because the internal deserts have become so vast. The prize and symposium are intended as a constructive intervention to help us change course. 5 criteria guide the selection of the prize winner. Number 1, the book must speak from a normative and authentic voice that aspires to be representative of a major religious or wisdom tradition, recognizing that all traditions are internally diverse and constantly evolving. Number 2, the book must be conversant with current ways of knowing about the world. In other words, the book must be academically informed. Number 3, it should engage one or more contemporary issues in global affairs, providing new ways to understand existing problems or identifying novel solutions to already well-defined problems. Number 4, it must have been published within the past 5 years, although earlier works that deserve recognition may be considered on an exceptional basis. So those were our original 4 criteria, and to these we added a 5th, which was implicit in our original purpose of the award, but on the advice of Azakaram, we made it explicit, which is that it must be conducive to generating a wide-ranging multi-faith conversation. The book, Cathonomics, met each of these criteria with flying colors. It is a tour de force in Catholic social tradition, guiding us from the old stuff to the new stuff, from Jesus, the early church fathers, Aristotelian virtue ethics, and Aquinas, to Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum and Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti. It contrasts these teachings with principles found in neoclassical economics, blending history and philosophy with empirical examples from the real world. The multi-faith symposium today was mind-blowingly rich, taking us from sodomy on the one end to the intricacies of quantum theory, vertical causality, and pure potentiality on the other. We discussed the impossibility of a value-neutral economics, but also the imperative of grounding policies on solid empirical ground. If this piques your interest, videos of our sessions will be available on our website in due time. So we are grateful to Tony for the gift of this book. and congratulate him on winning this award. The check is in the mail, but we have a small gift of our own fitting this occasion. Tony writes in his introduction that he grew up in a working-class household in Ireland. He was the first in his family to go to college. He chose to study economics because he wanted to help people. Even though he found the approach inadequate, he stuck with it, got a job in the IMF, and then came the crash. Everything changed for me with the global financial crisis, writes Tony. What for most of my colleagues was an economic crisis requiring technical policy solutions, was an ethical crisis requiring the re-embedding of economics in a better ethical worldview. Needless to say, most people at the IMF thought I was a little out there. That's from his preface. This was not an easy book to write, but it's always the one that Tony wanted to write, and that needed to be written. There were a lot of naysayers along the way, but in the end, he accomplished his goal, and that's a familiar story at Notre Dame. So we got you the Rudy jacket. Congratulations to Tony for winning this award. So you've got to watch the movie.
Okay.
I'll put this here and you can try it on.
What kind of jacket? What kind of jacket is that? Rudy jacket?
Thanks to Tim in the back for the special effects. So I'm going to turn it over to him, to Tony. For his remarks at the forum tonight, we've asked Tony to extend his insights into democracy. Can Cathonomics also help us create a better democracy? And after Tony's talk, Professor Anantanand Rambachan will host an interactive roundtable with the participants of today's Multi-Faith Symposium, the author, and all of you on Cathonomics. Please join me in welcoming Tony to the stage.
Thank you so much, Mahan, for very kind and gracious introduction. And thanks to everybody here at Notre Dame for such a warm welcome and for honoring this book. I'm just humbled and flattered that among such an illustrious group of people, you would consider Cathonomics for such an award. So thank you so much. I'm very grateful, very humbled by this award. But the question you've asked me to talk about tonight, very briefly, is the relationship between economics, Cathonomics, and democracy. So I will argue that good economics can support democracy, but bad economics can undermine democracy. Fundamentally, economics must center on human well-being. That's the argument that I put forward in Cathonomics for a vision of the economy inspired by the principles of Catholic social teaching. An economic vision that enhances democracy must have two pillars, one domestic and one global. On the domestic side, it must provide economic security and a decent standard of living for all people, as laid out, for example, in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it also has a global dimension. It must support the global common good through solidarity, and it must solve global problems through cooperation or through another Catholic principle known as subsidiarity. Let's look at how good and bad economics has emerged over the past century. I'm going to do this very quickly, but I think it's important to frame where we've come from and where we need to go. Before the First World War, free markets ruled the day. There was free movement of goods, capital, and even people. But because there wasn't universal suffrage, economics was not responsive to democracy. It was therefore easier to accept the kind of harsh adjustment under the old gold standard, adjustment that often involved deflation and very high unemployment. This was an era of high inequality, which gave rise to imperialism, which led to war, bad economics. But as the franchise expanded, in the post-war era in particular, politics was forced to pay more attention to economic well-being. It didn't always succeed. In fact, it failed pretty badly. After the war, democracy faltered in country after country as people turned to the nationalism of fascism or the radical leveling of communism. Both ideologies responded to economic dislocation provoked by war. On the global side of things, there was also a breakdown in cooperation. The newly established League of Nations proved toothless, and the United States refused to join. The Treaty of Versailles imposed ruinous economic reparations on Germany, which would pave the way for Hitler and the Nazis. Very few people warned about this in advance. Two of the people who did were John Maynard Keynes and Pope Benedict XV. In too many countries, the Great Depression proved a fatal blow to the system. Leaders like Franklin Roosevelt recognized that democracy itself was at stake. Shoring up democracy was one of the goals of the New Deal instituted by FDR, because FDR was very, very, very wary of demagogues like Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin, who were active at the time. It's also useful to look at the contrast between the United Kingdom and Germany. Sure, the United Kingdom had much stronger political institutions than did Weimar Germany, but we also need to look at unemployment insurance. The UK had in place a system of universal unemployment insurance by the time the Great Depression hit. Germany did not, and unemployment hit 30%. This was what paved the way for bringing Hitler to power. So economic institutions really matter. There were also failed attempts at global cooperation to try and solve the Great Depression cooperatively. There was a big conference in 1933 in London, which devolved into acrimony, and countries ended up turning towards trade and currency wars, which made things worse. Then things started to go right after the war. Everything changed after the Second World War. Countries opted to embark on a wholly new direction. They made a collective commitment to never again make these mistakes of the past, mistakes that led to war and economic ruin. And just as the pre-war breakdown had a domestic and a global dimension, so did the post-war renewal. On the domestic front, countries put in place systems of what we now know as social democracy or Christian democracy, founded on two main pillars, the welfare state and strong unions. Let's look at each one. On the welfare state, as documented by Thomas Piketty, what marks the social democratic era apart is the rise in taxation and spending. In Europe, taxes increased fourfold. In the US, they increased threefold, and that went into social assistance expenditures in areas such as education, healthcare, pensions, disability benefits, family support, active labor market policies, unemployment benefits, and housing. This protected people from adverse market outcomes and led to much lower levels of poverty and inequality. We also see this with unions and worker power. Unions made sure that workers benefited from rising prosperity. And countries in Europe in particular had sectoral bargaining, whereby collective bargaining agreements were extended to all workers in a particular sector or industry. So for example, in France, sectoral bargaining, collective bargaining coverage is 98%. 98% of all workers come under a collective bargaining agreement. This differs from the kind of plant level bargaining in the United States, where unions have tended to be weaker. From a peak of about 1/3 of workers in the post-war decades, private sector union membership is now down to 6%. A key point is on the economic front, as documented by the historian Tony Judd, social democracy and Christian democracy were well aligned. They both had different roots. Christian democracy in particular was rooted very much in Catholic social teaching, but on economics, there was a strong alignment. The US didn't have such a tradition, but the New Deal era did mirror some of its elements. And the New Deal institutions were accepted by both political parties and even imposed to some extent on Japan and Germany after their defeat in the war. There was also a revolution in global cooperation, especially during that multilateral moment of the 1940s. This gave us the Atlantic Charter, 1941, the Bretton Woods Institutions, 1944, the UN Charter, 1945, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and the Havana Charter for the International Trade Organization, also 1948. In terms of Bretton Woods, the IMF, my old institution, oversaw a system of fixed exchange rates backed up by strong financial regulation and controls on capital movements, which provided the stable backdrop to post-war economic boom. And in fact, the labor union, the CIO, the American Labor Union, once referred to Bretton Woods, BW, as standing for bread and wages. Some surprise for IMF critics there. At the same time, the Marshall Plan devoted huge financial resources to reconstruction in Europe. The International Trade Organization, which never came into being, by the way, was supposed to put trade in the service of full employment and economic development. But the US Congress never ratified it and it died away. But overall, despite some missed opportunities, global economic cooperation supported social democracy as it was being developed domestically. All this gave rise to the period 1945 to 1975, known as the 30 golden years on both sides of the Atlantic. This was an era of high economic growth, full employment, low inequality, and hardly any financial crisis. But in the 1970s, lower growth and higher inflation undermined faith in the system to keep delivering. This paved the way for the advent of what we now know as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was predicated on the liberating power of free and open markets. It held that free trade, free capital mobility, financial liberalization, weak unions, and a small government would lead to soaring economic gains. But these gains never materialize. Most of the gains went to the top and growth was a lot lower. Look at the United States, in a sense, the ground zero of neoliberalism. I want to present 5 indicators of economic precarity. First, growth. Average national income per adult grew by 2% a year in the social democratic era between 1945 and 1975, but only 1.4% a year after 1980, and actually only 0.8% after 2000. The only group that did better after 1980 was the top 1%. Point 2, inequality. The share of national income going to the top 1% doubled from 10% in 1980 to 20% today. It is now at levels last seen during the last Gilded Age. Point 3, wages. Since 1980, there's been a growing real wage gap between workers with college degrees and those who don't have college degrees. Working class men in particular have seen stagnant real wages for 4 decades. During the social democratic era, the New Deal era, wages closely tracked productivity growth. But after 1980, productivity kept growing, but wages did not. The gap went into corporate profits and high incomes. Point 4, the American dream. For the baby boomer generation, 80% will go on to earn more than their parents. By the time of the millennials, that's down to 50%. Point 5, life expectancy. In 1980, the US looked like a normal developed country, but it has now significantly lower life expectancy. In fact, life expectancy is falling for key demographics due to the so-called deaths of despair from opioids, alcohol poisoning, and suicide. Well, what explains all this? Economists often blame both technology and globalization. Well, you know, all countries experienced globalization. All countries had the same technological progress, but not all countries had these outcomes. So in my view, these 2 other factors need to be accounted for. 1, declining worker power, weaker unions, and an increasing fixation of corporations on maximizing shareholder value at the expense of workers. 2, cuts in top marginal tax rates, which made it more lucrative for firms to offer high compensation packages to workers at the very top of the distribution. If your marginal tax rate was 80%, it made no sense to give you a pay increase because the government was going to take most of it. But now everything was different. So in a sense, it was the fault of neoliberalism. We also saw a breakdown in the cooperative international order. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates broke down forever in 1973, and the IMF and the World Bank fully embraced neoliberalism. The World Trade Organization, founded in 1995, instead of focusing on full employment and economic development, focused on issues that benefited capital and corporations, such as capital account liberalization, intellectual property protection, and investor-state dispute mechanisms. How do we get all? So that's where we are. How do we fix things? Well, in Cathonomics, I argued that we are facing another 1930s moment as democracy is itself once again under threat. Once again, we are seeing the rise of demagogues offering easy answers and people to blame for their misfortune, whether malign foreigners or corrupt domestic elites. What we need, I would argue, is a reinvigorated social democracy. It has to be based on the old pillars of the welfare state and strong unions, but also on some new pillars. Let's talk about workplace democracy. It's interesting that Thomas Piketty, in accounting for the collapse of social democracy, pointed to the failure of workplace democracy to extend much beyond Germany and a few other Central European countries. The idea of workplace democracy, predicated on worker sharing in ownership and management of enterprises, is deeply embedded within Catholic social teaching. And when we talk about democracy today, we need to extend this to democracy in the workplace. What does that mean in practice? Plenty of examples. We can think of worker cooperatives like Mondragon in Spain. We can think of co-determination, worker representatives on board of directors as you have in Germany. You can have firm-level work councils like you also have in Germany. You can have profit sharing like you have in France. Or you can have wage earner funds where firms use profits to issue stock into funds controlled by unions, as was attempted in Sweden, but ultimately didn't succeed. I think you also going to need decarbonization, by the way, is another new pillar, which entails the largest ever financial transformation in the shortest amount of time. The reason why I call this part of social democracy or Christian democracy is because technological and financial resources will need to be guided in a different direction than would be directed by the free market. It will require large-scale public investments, industrial policy, and public-private partnerships. Now, the original social democracy did engage in this kind of planning and industrial policy, most notably right here in the United States, which created, for example, the space industry, space science, the development of the internet, and the Human Genome Project. As well as domestic social democratic moment, we also need to get back to that other dimension, enhanced global cooperation. And in particular, we need all hands on deck to support the all-important UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially financing the SDGs in poorer countries, and also rallying around the Paris Agreement on climate change. They are the two big pillars of global cooperation today. So to sum things up, I am arguing for an approach based on Cathonomics to shore up democracy. I would argue that this presents no risks in a pluralistic society, as what I am really calling for is a new vision of social democracy, a new social democratic moment. And in my view, we can identify an overlapping consensus from the different religious and secular ethical traditions for this new sense of social democracy. Jean Rawls made such an argument. Jacques Maritain also made such an argument as to why people should be willing to accept universal human rights, even if the reasons for defending those rights might differ across traditions. But it really, at the end of the day, all boils down to a need to restore a holistic vision of the common good and to get away from the ideology or even the idolatry of the free market. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
I will have to listen. Sorry. I would like to invite our panelists to please join us. Thank you.
So, guys, you kind of share the microphone on this side. Okay, so use it.
Looks like we're trying to have a city.
We're all friends.
Oh, we are now. We need one more.
You have a chair.
You can start.
What was that? Yeah, well, greetings, everyone, and it's a privilege to moderate this wonderful group of presenters joining us, of course, with Tony. And thank you so much, Tony, for these very succinct remarks on the relationship between democracy and economics. You gave us both a historical overview of this relationship, but ended with some normative statements about what we need to build a healthy relationship between economy and democratic institutions. So I thank you very much for that. Our format will be very simple. I will give our panelists an opportunity to engage with Tony. And after they have exhausted themselves in that engagement, we'll open up the discussion to you for your questions, addressed perhaps to Tony, but I'll allow our panelists to respond also because they may have things to add or bring their insights of their disciplines and traditions to what Tony might say. But if I would use the moderator's privilege to ask the first question, Tony. And it's a simple one, I hope. Where do you find hope for the transformation that you would like to see?
Yeah, that's a very good. It's on. That's a very good question. You would think sometimes if you read the news every day or read the New York Times as I do every morning, you feel like there's no hope. But where I mainly see hope is with the younger generation, because I think they have fully realized that the global economy they are inheriting doesn't work for everybody, and they're especially aware of that in terms of the environmental crisis. So they are crying out for a new economic and ecological model, and their worldview is fundamentally different from the worldview of prior generations, I would argue.
Thank you. So I ask our esteemed panelists if you had particular questions for Tony arising out of his comments tonight or subjects and themes in his book that you didn't have time to address in your presentation, please indicate. Yes.
If I may, can I answer or address the same question that you asked Tony? Where do you find hope? Yes, I find hope in the young generations as well, but I also find some hope in terms of what is actually happening in the European Union and has been happening there for the last several decades. You know, at the end of World War II, against the devastation and the chaos and the destruction and the killing that took place in Europe, I think the Europeans finally got their act together and they decided that there is a better way of managing our space and running the world. And that is the way of cooperation, of finding common interests. And the European Union is not only the region of the world that has the lowest levels of inequality in the world, To use a technical term, they have on average the lowest Gini coefficients, but it is also a group of 29 nations that are building an institutional infrastructure, a European Parliament, a European Court of Justice, there is a European Central Bank, there is an executive in Brussels. It is not easy, it is not perfect, it is not blameless, but it is a very creative experiment of international cooperation. And, you know, I come from Latin America, and I wish we had the foresight. I wish we had the kind of leadership in my region of the world that the Europeans had in the late 40s or early 1950s to create these supranational organizations. To me, that is the way of the future. I think ultimately the world will go in that direction. And for that reason, what's happening in Europe is highly significant.
Please.
Thank you. Earlier in the symposium, we had a question about the idea of degrowth. And a lot of our wisdom traditions would kind of suggest that in order to have enough for all, people who have plenty, or maybe everybody, should learn to make do with less and be willing to make do with less. So Tony, I would ask, how should we think about growth?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's no easy answer to that question. I would start by arguing that what the fundamental problem is not so much growth, but the carbon intensity of growth. And what we are seeing now is a decoupling of growth from carbon emissions. Growth is continuing to go up and emissions are going down. And we're seeing this in country after country, and that's a very positive sign. I would also argue that very mechanically, decarbonization, investing in the green economy, is going to show up in national accounts as growth. It's very mechanically, that's what it is. So in a sense, you need growth if you want decarbonization. But there is a more fundamental kind of ethical issue there that we need to grapple with, which Pope Francis really puts his finger on in Laudato Si. And that's the issue that if we focus so much on consumption, more, this presents problems. This presents ethical problems. And as we know as economists, that growth is driven by consumption, but should consumption drive our lives? Do we always need the whirlwind of needless buying and spending, as to quote Pope Francis in Laudato Si? And I think he really challenges very deeply on that point.
Tony, you argue in the book that wind and solar power will be sufficient if we make, say, 2% investment of GDP to electrify everything. How confident are you of that?
Well, as someone who knows absolutely nothing about wind and solar, I'm just going on what the experts are saying. I read the literature, which basically says that, you know, wind and solar are now, by a long shot, the cheapest forms of energy, which is why they're growing exponentially all over the world. The problem is we have a lot of legacy high carbon industry energy that isn't going anywhere in a hurry. But I think that the issue so much isn't technical anymore. 10 years ago, it would have been a technical issue. Today, not so much a technical issue. It's no longer even a financial issue. We know how much it costs. We can do it. It's an issue of political will and strong vested interests. That's the issue we face today.
Oh, please.
I wanted to pick up on the question of growth and degrowth and ask how you think population trends may affect the potential for all of this going forward. I know in the US there's been a dropping birth rate and even concerns about enrollment in colleges across US higher ed from the 2008 crisis. Will we see the same after COVID? And certainly in other economic powerhouses like China, it's the population problem that poses perhaps one of the biggest challenges for a fruitful way forward.
That's a really good question. I think, some environmentalists are still stuck in the 1970s where they claim that overpopulation is a problem. In fact, today, the real problem comes from looming underpopulation, I would argue. We're seeing that in Europe, where population growth is below replacement. We're seeing it in China, we're seeing it in Japan, in Korea, all over the world. In fact, the only growing area of the world, strongly growing area of the world right now is Africa, and that won't be forever either. For someone who believes in social insurance and welfare states as much as I do, this presents serious problems. If you have a lot of old retired people and very few working people, you can't fund those programs. So I think this is going to be a huge challenge in the years ahead.
Thank you. In the book and in the talk you just gave, you present what I think is a really powerful ethical contrast between social democracy and neoliberalism. But when you tell the story of the transfer from one to the other, I can't tell if there's a sort of working of historical forces or if it's just a bunch of people making bad decisions. And the reason I ask that is because I wonder, based on objections that many Marxists have made or based on world systems theory kinds of objections, what is to prevent us from winning social democracy back and then losing it again? And, if we save the world in the process, that's great. Then we will just have to deal with horrible inequality and all of that without the looming extinction of the species. But I wonder if you really think it all does come down to us just making good choices, or if there are some sorts of sociological kinds of factors that also affect your thinking.
That's a really good question. I would argue that there was a lot of contingency after the Second World War. Given the horrors that the world had gone through, they wanted to completely change the way they did things. So that was one factor. There was also an incredible amount of post-war solidarity, which was extended into the post-war decades and really only faded away when the generations turned in the 1970s and 1980s, I would argue. In fact, that kind of what's now known as the greatest generation is well known as a very solidaristic generation. There was also the fact that the Great Depression and late 20s, early 30s completely discredited free market economics for decades. And it was only when, again, people started forgetting about the Great Depression that free market economics came back into fashion. We also should not forget communism, because communism in the 1940s was a viable alternative on people's minds. We forget that communist parties in France and in Italy were extremely large. We forget that economic growth rates in communist countries in the 1940s and 1950s were strong. The Soviet Union really only started to fade in the 1970s. So people were really nervous about communism, and they felt that liberal democracy had to offer something to counter the story that communists were telling about workers and worker rights. And of course, it's no accident that neoliberalism reached its maximum point after 1989, when communism was no longer a story. So I think these historical contingencies definitely need to be taken into account. And I think if we understand the reasons why social democracy and global cooperation emerged, it helps put us on a more secure footing for kind of reimagining that world today.
Professor Singh?
Thank you. Tony, again, this has just been a wonderful day, and your book is very thought-provoking. But I want to, keep returning to what I think is a challenge, which is that a lot of your perspectives are based on the experience of countries which have been almost wholly Christian. Religious identity at its best, leads to positive personal and collective transformations, but it doesn't always work that way. And so how would one implement Cathonomics in India? Or would you have Hindunomics? I think there's some challenges here.
I think that's an excellent question. I'm going to turn it over in a second to the expert on Hindu economics right here. But I will say that Amartya Sen has been really good at retrieving from his own Indian tradition various traditions of an ethical economics that goes back to Ashoka and I think it's Kautilya, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, from those early centuries of Indian civilization. So Anand, do you want to?
But he's an atheist. He says he's an atheist.
Right, but he's appealing to both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, I think.
Just very briefly, Tony, I think one of the important insights that emerged from all of the discussions that we had today and all of the rich presentations is that, and I don't want to homogenize these traditions or to overlook the great diversity that they have, but I think what we saw in our discussion was a good consensus around ethical values that we need for the transformation and for the building of an economic institutions that work for the good life for all. And I think we could look to each of our traditions to retrieve those distinctive but also shared values to do that. So let me perhaps turn your question to me, because I can, go on to speak about, some of the values within the Hindu tradition, the commitment to the universal common good and, sharing and generosity and so on. But you ended your remarks tonight on an interreligious note. And so perhaps leaving this meeting, one of the challenges that we should all ask ourselves, how can we sustain the work of advancing this interreligious cooperation to build the kinds of economic institutions that sustain democracy but enhance the flourishing of our planet? How do we go about sustaining that kind of conversation and that work? What would you suggest?
I want to go back to the 1940s, that moment, that multilateral moment. And if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you look at who the drafters were, it was directed by Eleanor Roosevelt. The drafters included a Lebanese Christian, a Chinese Confucian, a Latin American Catholic, an Indian secular woman, and a French Jew. They were all came from fundamentally different traditions, but they were all able to affirm we support these universal human rights in their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural realms. And I thought that was an amazing achievement. I'm still fascinated by that whole period of history. And I think we have a job to do the same thing today. We have to accept all of our different traditions without diluting it into a lowest common denominator. That's not the way to do it. But, to affirm the values of an ethical economy from our own traditions. And I think the world is really crying out for that kind of vision.
Any comments from we had one from my left. Joe, anything?
I'll ask a question. So I'm actually really interested in hearing you, Tony, try to put together a little bit of an agenda, because lately when I watch at least US politics, I'm less and less confident that we can get a lot of big stuff done at once. But sometimes we can get like one or two things done. And particularly with the climate change, the necessity for real policy action to deal with climate change, I'm thinking an expansion of social democracy, we probably have to make some hard choices about what kind of things we really pursue. So I'd love to hear like what's at the very top of the reforms that you would propose for the US. But then I'd also be really interested in hearing what you would propose for the UK. What's the low-hanging fruit in terms of moving forward?
Well, I think the low-hanging fruit for the US, if you ask me for the two things you should do, I would say one, strengthen unions, pass the Protect the Right to Organize Act, which is supported by the AFL-CIO, and two, reintroduced the expanded child tax credit, which in 2021 lowered child poverty by 40% and was shamefully allowed to expire. So that's low-hanging fruit. We can easily do that to support families and to support workers. Beyond that, I am actually not as pessimistic on whether we can have a future social democratic moment, because I'm seeing chinks in the armor. You're seeing people in the Republican Party take stances that are not neoliberal, that are not Trumpist either, but they are supportive of workers. And we haven't seen that in decades. So that's a positive sign. On the UK, I don't have any easy answers there. The UK faces a major productivity crisis, but I would say ending a decade of fiscal austerity might be a helpful start.
Thank you, Tony. And on the topic of work, the worker keeps coming up over and over again. And a question I have for you is, what ideas or resources do you see for thinking about not just is the worker compensated in a way that is conducive to a full life, but the conditions of work are conducive to the mental, spiritual, if I can invoke that term, welfare of the worker? Because actually earlier today, I think at the second panel, afterwards, you were talking with the panelists, and I believe you said even Adam Smith had something like Marxist theory of alienation. And from the Buddhist tradition in particular, cultivating in one's daily life the capacity not to enact violence, really, is very important for the welfare of the individual and then for the welfare of society. So is there a way to continue to have mass production? I think here of like factory farming of animals. This is extremely detrimental not only to the animals, but to the workers physically and mentally and emotionally. And they're not compensated well. And teenagers are dying in America doing that work because the controls aren't there for that. So how can we continue to produce at the level we have been, which is necessary for our society? I'm not naive about what we need in terms of production, but also honor the welfare of workers as they do their work.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point and a good question. I would start by saying, during the social democratic era, 1945 to 1975, it was very much based on manufacturing. Most workers were in manufacturing, and workers took great pride in the work they did on the factory floor. It was a source of great meaning and purpose, dignity, and respect. But we are no longer a manufacturing economy. Manufacturing employment has been dropping for decades. We are now a services-based economy, and that has bifurcated. On one hand, you have fairly well-off service sector professionals, the lawyers, the doctors, the finance people. They're doing fine. But on the other hand, you have very precarious service sector workers, low wages, low protections, lots of coercive control over their workplace, little in the way of autonomy, no voice, which works against dignity and respect of workers. You see this clearly if you look at the way workers are monitored on an Amazon factory, for example, how they're basically every second of their day is monitored, and they have no control over their work. I think that the emphasis I gave on co-determination, that if you have workers on boards of directors, are probably even more pertinent if you have work councils. If workers can have a say in the day-to-day management of the enterprises, that will be conducive to greater dignity and respect in the world of work. And it's especially important now that we've moved from this manufacturing model to this more precarious services model.
Let me give Thomas and then I'll come to you.
Okay. Thank you. Anthony, so we are discussing the relationship between economy and democracy. The economy has gone global, I'm wondering, what do you see as needed in terms of strengthening global governance and including, why not, no, a global democracy?
Yes. So Catholic social teaching is actually very strong on this point. All popes since Pius XII have praised the United Nations. And the person who went the furthest here was Pope Benedict XVI, who called for a world political authority with real teeth. So I thought that was very profound. Catholic social teaching recognizes that there are various problems that are global problems and hence require global solutions. That's an exercise in subsidiarity as well as solidarity. So I would argue that you need global governance in areas like monitoring progress on climate change under the Paris Agreement, supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, curbing tax havens, establishing forms of debt relief. I discuss in a number of areas in Cathonomics where global governance might be needed, and I think that's another very important part of the ethical economy.
So we'll have a last question from our panelists, because I want to give enough time for our audience to be drawn. So you got the last one.
If I could just ask you to build up a little bit on the last question posed by
Thomas, yeah.
and your comments. Would you consider that perhaps going back to the 1945 UN Charter and sort of bringing it into the 21st century, right? Because it's an interesting little historical aside. When Harry Truman gave the closing speech at the San Francisco conference in 1945, he said that this is a living document. This is something that will be amended as our own constitution has been amended multiple times, to reflect changes in the world. His point was these human institutions need to adapt themselves to changing times. That has not happened with the UN Charter, right? At the San Francisco conference, they introduced Article 109, which allows for the possibility of a review conference within 10 years. And that conference has never taken place because by 1955, we're in the middle of the Cold War. So it would seem to me that as we contemplate reforms to our global governance architecture, one important element of that, should be to basically modernize the UN Charter, to bring it into the 21st century. And my question to you is, do you see the Catholic Church as being a potential catalyst in triggering that process? Because we need powerful actors. We need organizations that represent hundreds, if not billions of people, who basically take a stand on that. And I'm just curious to know what you think.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I would just preface that by saying in my old organization, the IMF, the combined vote share of India and China is 9%. This is insane in the modern economy. The fact that India and Brazil don't have seats on the UN Security Council makes no sense. So yes, we need an updated UN Charter. We need an updated Bretton Woods Charter to solve modern problems. Yes, I think that the Catholic Church is well positioned to exert global moral leadership on this issue. I think that, no disrespect to all my friends here from different religious traditions, but I think Pope Francis is indeed the world's moral leader. Very few other leaders have the reach that he has, have the respect that he has that goes beyond the Catholic world. So I think that, if we can use that force for good to push for these kinds of global ethical changes, it would really be a game changer.
Thank you very much. So I come now to our audience and the esteemed audience, and I will start with Professor Karam and then come to the gentleman on my left.
Thank you very much indeed. You may have heard me in the background humming and hawing. This was a brilliant conversation, and I'm very grateful to each and all of you for the course of the contributions over the day. With respect to the last couple of questions that I think have been super pertinent, every single question was great, but this idea of multilateralism and where we go from here within the multilateral space, and I'm asking that question to all of you, so not just to poor Tony, who has to be on the chopping block for all of us, but I think more, given that multilateralism itself and the multilateral institutions as the United Nations system altogether, not only specific institutions, whether IMF or World Bank or whatever, but given that we're facing a crisis of multilateralism, the ability to work collaboratively between different institutions, I still remain a bit baffled by how we will go from that reality where we're finding it less easy to collaborate or less quick to collaborate to one in which we're all collaborating based on shared ethical values. It's that particular, I completely agree that that's where we need to go, but I'm a little bit, again, curious, and I've given Thomas a hard time already about this, trying to understand the how we would make that particular shift. And secondly, on the idea that any one particular religion could give the guide to the rest of the world to reach that particular ethical shore, can I just register that I'm not sure that would work? One can dream and aspire, but I also think that there are over 1.whatever billion Christians, not just Catholics in this world, but the rest of the world of 7 or 8 billion, soon to be 8 billion, is actually plenty other religions. And I'm not sure that beyond the historical value of colonialism being led by certain religions, that there's really the moral case for any one religion now deciding to turn the world for the global common good. So I just want to register the wee little cynicism. I'm open to being convinced otherwise, but I do think that it behooves us to be exactly what you said, Tony, respectful of many other existing extraordinarily active religions, not, by the way, all working for the global common good. In fact, some members of some of these religions, frankly, working for their own good, which is in direct contradiction to the common good. So just that we keep those dynamics in mind as we all try to join in the support for a particular religious leadership in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ezra. Maybe we can take your question or comment, and then I will ask Tony and others to respond. You can introduce yourself.
I'm Jerry Powers. I'm here at the Kroc Institute. Concentrations of power, I think, are preventing us from pursuing the political and economic reforms that you're talking about, it would seem. And, the response to the Gilded Age was, in part, one of the major responses was the antitrust laws. Since the early 1980s, the Supreme Court has systematically reduced the teeth of the antitrust laws, and most administrations have not enforced them. The Biden administration is enforcing the antitrust laws a bit. But if you don't break up Amazon, Meta, and virtually every sector of the economy is dominated by relatively few entities, then I don't see what the hope is.
Thank you. So,
well, I would like to hear from my colleagues.
Okay. Okay, sure. You would like to comment, please.
I'm only going to comment on one of these things, and that is just to tell you the briefest of story. I'm thinking about the power of a religious tradition to be able to try to build solidarity at a global scale. It's obviously a difficult problem. So 2 days ago, I was in a small committee in my church talking about how our congregation could move closer to carbon neutrality, and there's a conviction in our church that this is something that we should do, and we talk about it in explicitly Christian terms. It occurs to me that kind of has to happen all over the world, because religious language is often the language we use to discuss our strongest commitments. That means everyone has to use that kind of language to make really big decisions. So that means it's kind of up to all of us to build these kind of solidarity movements within the languages of our traditions wherever we are. So even if one religion isn't going to be able to offer sort of leadership for the whole globe, we all kind of have to take responsibility for our communities in that sense and make the case in those terms. And I think that's the way I'd think about it. I sort of think that's the way I read Tony's book as well, to say, I can speak you here could speak to the Catholic community in particular, and then hope that other people can look at this and say, hey, there's something beautiful here. And you know what? I think it sort of applies to my tradition as well.
I just wanted to speak to the potential hurdles in Catholicism serving as this practically unifying religious tradition, as you were saying, because I think we have to not be naive and not forget the added challenges that come with the Catholic Church being both a global religion and also the Vatican City State. And at least in East Asia, that's been a very difficult sticking point insofar as dialogues are not only about, sort of a religious figure like Pope Francis, but Catholicism is the only religion that actually has a state attached to it. And so you have to take that into account when grappling with, say, like mainland Chinese concerns that even today, the Holy See is a political entity and not just a religious entity. So that I think is a challenge for some of these efforts to claim something like a purely moral space.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, please, Professor Singh.
Just a comment on antitrust, because I think here there's actually a very nice contrast between the European Union and the United States, where with some of these tech giants, the European Union has much stronger policies to protect individual privacy and things like that. Not quite in the realm of price control and so on, and they don't have the power to break them up. But I think you can sort of see how a political consensus and a different philosophy of what an economy should look like is leading to somewhat better policies. And then you see California sometimes trying to follow the European Union in how it does these things, but then a lot of these things are not happening at the US federal level for various reasons.
Anyone wanted to respond to, as I raised a specific question on difficulty of multilateralism challenges? Was there anyone who would like to comment on or respond to? I don't want to fly over Azza's question, but we can come back to it again. Okay. Please go ahead.
Hi, good evening. My name is Alejandro Estefan. I am an assistant professor of economics here. I teach principles of economics, and very much in a neoliberal fashion. Thank you for inviting me to the event. So I guess it's obviously a very complex, difficult set of topics, the ones that you raise in the book. To me, I guess the acid test for the whole of it is the first concept in economics, which is the problem of scarcity and the economic problem, right? Or the acknowledgement that material reality is of a nature that goods are insufficient for everyone to fulfill all their needs, and that poses, of course, a question as to how to distribute them and allocate them between people. I guess economics would say, or neoliberal economics would say, that the best way of distributing goods is by choosing the most productive allocation, or the one that maximizes the good for everyone, right? So just to give a silly example, if there are two people seeking for a single job post, who should get the job there? But perhaps the most productive person would, that's what economics would say, right? And I guess my question is, what do you make of what's your answer to the problem of scarcity? I mean, I know that you address many other topics in the textbook, but going back to sort of Econ 101 and the first lecture, the first concept of economics, I'd like to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, very important question. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective because I'm going to put aside microeconomics because I don't do microeconomics. I'm going to come from the macro perspective. But from the macro perspective, in 1930, John Maynard Keynes wrote a remarkable essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And he was looking forward to what the world would look like pretty much today. It was written in 1930, so he was thinking of what it would look like today. And he made the prediction that what you call the economic problem would be solved. In other words, we would have enough resources to meet everybody's needs. And as a result of that, people would only work 15-hour weeks. Now, Keynes was wrong about the 15-hour week thing. Well, vastly wrong. But was he really wrong on the fact that the economic problem has been solved? I think in many respects, we can argue that he was right. We are a $100 trillion global economy, and yet 700 million people still live in extreme poverty. That's not an issue of scarcity. That's an issue of an ethical misallocation of resources. So I think if we go back to that Keynes's insight and move and stop thinking so much about scarcity and talk more about flourishing and the ethical allocation of resources, I think that could help focus our minds as to what's really important today.
If I could just add 2 footnotes to your statement. We spend annually, according to the IMF, the equivalent of 7% of world GDP subsidizing energy, which accelerates climate change on the one hand. Is also highly regressive. 60% of the benefit of the gasoline subsidy goes to the top 20% of the income distribution, right? We spend many more $1 trillion, of course, maintaining our military establishments and our current system of collective security, which is non-existent, right? So here we have already 2 huge pockets of resources, which could go a long way to take us from the current situation where we have 800 million malnourished individuals, right? Which is really such a terrible commentary on the way we have organized ourselves within the context of a 100 trillion economy. So the issue is not lack of resources. The issue is whatever, lack of solidarity, faulty tax systems. All of these amenable, of course, to change. It is not lack of knowledge that our problem. It's lack of political will.
Yes, the economizing definition of economics really became popular after Lionel Robbins' essay on the nature and significance of economic science back in the 1930s. Prior to that, there was the idea that economics deals with the domain of activity, not economizing processes. And so there's a wonderful book written by Kerzner that surveys the history of definitions of economics. And I would argue that the real core of economics is that it is trying to make an argument that economic activity is a separate domain from the rest of social life, that economic activity with the pursuit of self-interest will lead to beneficent outcomes, whereas other social, moral, political, ethical areas of life are going to require the conscious balancing of self-interest with social considerations. And so I believe that that really represents the core of economics, from classical economic theory to neoclassical economic theory. The economizing process approach is something that's much more new, and it doesn't unite classical and neoclassical theory.
Yes, please.
I'll be brief. I would just like to say, in response to this query from our colleague here at Notre Dame, right? I am not an economist, so we heard answers from economists, But as a Buddhist philosopher, when I hear that question, what I hear is that you are engaging as a professor of economics in a form of ethical training, where you are giving a kind of moral principle of not enough to students, to young adults, I assume mostly young adults. And that is going to profoundly shape the way they understand themselves in society. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. You want to respond briefly, quickly, please?
I mean, I don't mean to be controversial, or I was invited, very kindly decided to come. So please don't take this as a statement oriented toward contradicting the statements made here. But I guess just to clarify about scarcity and what we mean in neoclassical economics about scarcity, it is the acknowledgement that opportunity cost exists, and when we do something, we decide not to do something else, right? So and that decisions come with trade-offs in general. So I guess it is easier to understand this when we speak about time, perhaps not so much about policy. It's a bit more difficult to see this in policy, but if we think about how we allocate our own time, we're implicitly making choices over something that's not infinite, right? So we decide to come to this talk and not do one more hour of research, or teach another hour, or just watch television, right? So I guess we kind of do everything, right? And then that involves making choices that contain in them some trade-offs. And I think that the same applies in macroeconomics, right? So the moment we decide to do some policy or implement a policy, we are failing to do something else. And in a way, if I guess we have a list of policies that should be implemented, that's fine. We can implement them, all of them. But I guess I wanted to hear more about the sacrifices that we're letting go by implementing them. I guess that was my real question. It is about, if we have this series of very normative policies to implement, those will lead to some outcomes that we may not have thought of in detail. I guess that's the real content of the question, right? So all the policies proposed here, they obviously come with their own set of consequences, and I wanted to hear more about them rather than just, I guess, the positive that will come from them, or the good that will come from them. I guess that's the.
But Mary, you'd like to comment, please?
Can I ask a question of my fellow countrymen, whose work is absolutely fascinating, and maybe it is a little controversial, but maybe it's not on. Now it's on. The question is, if Cathonomics can offer global answers to problems of the problems that we face with globalization and our global economies, but can it offer a response and an answer internally within a church that faces on 3 continents a serious existential crisis of its own? And to what extent is Cathonomics possibly as a global response? And the church, indeed, as was it one of the Secretary Generals of the United Nations described it as the pulpit of the world. To what extent is that being now undermined? The power of that in the world being undermined by the existential crisis that the church faces, largely of its own making, arguably, but also, of course, in an increasingly secularized world.
Yeah, very quickly, I would just say that, you raise a very important question. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, other than to say that most Catholics are not familiar with Catholic social teaching whatsoever. They know nothing about it. They think it's somehow to do with politics, and therefore it shouldn't be associated with the church. But I think that, after the Second Vatican Council, some of the regions of the world which most embraced Catholic social teaching, I'd say in Latin America, turned out to be pretty vibrant regions. And you had all these great documents, meetings from Medellin in '68 to Aparecida in 7, I think it was. Whereas regions that ignored Catholic social teaching, and I would put Ireland in this boat, certainly when I was growing up there, maybe it's different now, have tend to fare, I would say, more poorly. So I do think that if the church is going to evangelize this culture, this increasingly secular, hostile culture, then it cannot do so from a position of defensiveness or arrogance or hubris. But and in that way, Catholic social teaching can actually be a great help for it, I think.
Thank you. Scott, Dean.
Okay, I have a question. Okay, I have a question I'd like each of you to answer. We'll go around down the line. And Alejandro will be taking notes. The economist back there as to your answers, although it doesn't really relate to his intervention. This is from a dean who constantly, partly is paid to talk about how great Notre Dame is and the Catholic tradition is, and why should you come to this university, and why should we be in the conversation about X, Y, or Z? But I often wonder. So I have two questions. One, the first one is you can say agree or disagree. You're free to comment, but agree or disagree of all the various wisdom and religious traditions you represent on this stage. Agree or disagree, the one tradition that has produced a more or less coherent, detailed, historically somewhat resonant body of social teaching from within your rich theological and ethical traditions is the Catholic Church or Catholic tradition. Do you agree or disagree with that? You can elaborate. Would that be a fair statement? And secondly, does that tradition, because you're not like, you know much more than regular Catholics, as Tony said, you know something about the Catholic social tradition, and you all know quite a bit about it. So whatever you say to the first question, do you find the tradition, this is kind of part of what Ansari is doing in this in strategic plan, do you find the tradition, the Catholic social teaching is what I mean, sufficiently robust, flexible, nuanced, and collegial, if I could put it that way, that the effort, however preliminary, to bring the various traditions together in a deep engagement with that tradition that deepens it, broadens it, enriches it, is a worthwhile exercise. So, please begin.
Rapid response.
Agree or disagree?
Catholics, of these various ethical, theological, rich traditions, this is the one that, hopefully for better, has produced a coherent body of thought on modern social teaching. And I'm glad we start with you because you can immediately refute this proposition, but therefore I want you to comment a little bit.
Well, I'm asking, does the question seems to presume that I have knowledge of all of the traditions.
Just from your own perspective.
Well, you used the word coherent. So Jews are ruled out from the get-go. That's just not going to be a territory on which we contend. Whether it's worth engaging, though, I think yes. It's sort of something that was mentioned here earlier about the relationship to statehood, the Vatican being a state. Some of the traditions up here have been associated with great world-spanning empires, and others of the traditions up here have been minority traditions most everywhere that they've been. So I think the habituation to being in charge is the kind of thing that leads to the production of coherent bodies of thought about how you should run things. That can be helpful to engage when you're not used to being in charge, but it doesn't mean that you want to just go and adopt it.
No, I think the Buddhist tradition and the modern era in particular, starting in the late 19th century, produces a very coherent social and theory with implications for politics and economics.
Thank you. Maybe if I can reframe just a little bit the question, I would ask if which worldview would be the better and which tradition can inform the new worldview that we need in the 21st century. And if you ask that question, I would think, for example, I would emphasize indigenous worldviews, for example. And I think the Pope Francis did a great job of trying to reframe that relationship between Christians and the natural world, which show that it's possible, but it's not definitely the richest tradition in that sense to build a new relationship with the natural world, which I think is really an important aspect of the future.
Okay, so I'm coming from the Protestant Christian tradition, Reform specifically, and we often actually have Catholic envy because our own tradition just isn't nearly as well developed. And so I'd say, yeah, Catholics are way ahead of us, and there's a lot to learn from, even when I don't agree on some of the specifics. I've learned a ton by studying Catholic social thought and the way they've engaged the tradition that I'm a part of, even.
I think if the question is whether Catholicism is unique in providing a system, I think I would say no. I deeply, deeply appreciate Catholic social teaching and think it offers so much and can host a kind of wide-ranging conversation. But I just don't think it's unique in offering that kind of a scope. And much of my presentation today was trying to demonstrate an entire alternate intellectual history that whether you look at the Mohists or perhaps the Confucians had a longer cross-dynastic kind of claim on China and its development. This is a millennia-long Chinese social teaching tradition. As for whether the Catholic social teaching tradition is hospitable, I mean, I think I would say yes, in the sense that here we are doing it, right? We're having a conversation, and Catholic social teaching gives us a starting place. But I do think that it must be open to revisions and contextual considerations. So just as one really concrete example, I think a document like Rerum Novarum, that launches so many of these conversations, does assume that industrialization and urbanization go hand in hand. And in the mainland Chinese context, especially after the foundation of the People's Republic of China, there's a very concerted effort to have rural industrialization, right? So like even some of the assumptions about the social ills that Rerum Novarum is trying to treat are just structured differently in mainland China, where you have say the hukou system that doesn't let people move, or where you're required to stay in place in your rural context while the factories are built. So that I think the Catholic social teaching is certainly hospitable to starting the conversation, but then we need to start getting specific about context.
I guess I would share broadly the spirit of what just has been said. First of all, I have deep respect for the sort of contributions made to social teachings coming from the Catholic Church. After all, they've been around for a couple of thousand years, right? So there's a lot to build on. They have an advantage over many of the other religious traditions sitting around the table. But as strong as that tradition is, I think that the problems in the world today are so incredibly complex that I think we need to build on top of that. In other words, it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And how do we build on top of that? Well, there is the richness of other traditions coming in from other parts of the world that add to that. And so I guess what I'm saying is we need to work together. We need to build bridges. And I see the Catholic Church as being essentially the convener of that conversation in coming years and decades, because they have the credibility, because they have the resources, because they have 2,000 years behind them. So we look forward to that conversation, working together with them to address the problems of the world. On their own, I don't think they will be able to do it. That is the reality of the world in which we face, right? As spread as Catholicism is all over the world, I think we need more than that.
I'm also from the Catholic tradition, and so I can say that our tradition is coherent. You know, as Tony was saying, the social teachings go all the way back to our belief in the Trinity and about the human person. But what we also claim that we haven't talked a lot about is that we claim that these particular teachings are intelligible to anyone of any faith because they're actually rooted in the natural law. And I'll say in my own path, I've had the opportunity to see that by being personally close to a lot of folks who identify as atheists. And when I used to work at a labor union, a number of my coworkers were very actively hostile to organized religion. But when I would talk about the social doctrine, they said, "Oh, that's great. I love this. That's what the church teaches," you know. So I don't think, also to your question, we're not saying that this is the world we should build because this or that religion says so, right? We're saying this vision is inherently really attractive to you person, you know, wherever you are in the globe, right? This is what we believe. We might say why this is so for different reasons based on our different faith or wisdom traditions, but it's really not, at least from a natural law perspective, it's not an appeal to authority, right? It's an appeal to the vision of goodness that every person can access. And this is what looks like in economic practice.
What's the thing?
Thank you. Yeah, so this is actually a very complicated question that I don't think one can just say agree or disagree. And, you know, there's so many complexities involved, not just in terms of, you know, history and, you know, asymmetries of power and modes of communication, but also in, you know, questions of reason. And I've been trying to think about this and articulate it. And so the Sikh tradition doesn't really have quite the same, you know, kind of things like encyclicals, you know, and some of that is because maybe it's decentralized, but I don't think it's just that. It's also that the main focus is on, you know, a certain level of, you know, understanding of reality, which, as I said earlier today, I mean, you can find in other traditions. What Professor Annett put it as is, you know, individual transformation in a positive way. And I think in the Sikh tradition and other traditions, that is not in isolation, but also as part of a, you know, social transformation. So it's not clear to me that one should push religion too far. I mean, it's a good starting point. You know, if I want to understand a lot of these issues, and I'm reading, you know, Amartya Sen, who's an atheist, or Elizabeth Anderson, or Michael Sandel, and, you know, other analytical philosophers, they're not taking any position that is based on their religious beliefs. And in some ways, I'm actually more comfortable with that as a way of I mean, hopefully their religious beliefs are kind of making them, you know, good philosophers, but it's not so simple, I think, as just, you know, comparing different religious traditions and picking among them and so on. I'm still not getting at what I exactly want to say, but I hope this helps.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about your first question. From an Islamic perspective, you know, it's very decentralized, and therefore we don't have encyclicals. We have to kind of cull Islamic social teachings from the different scholars of philosophical ethics and legal ethics and so forth. And so it's a very complex question, but I do believe that we have a coherent body of thought. It might not be as visible as it is in the Catholic Church, in Catholicism. That being said, I believe the Catholic social teaching is very collegial, and I think there is a great deal of similarity between Catholic and Islamic social teaching. Sorry.
Can I just thank each one of you for those great responses? If my question was heard as even a little bit triumphalistically Catholic, that was the intent. So that partly that's true, because I wanted pushback from that kind of ridiculous question, and then you gave it to me in nuanced ways. So thank you.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'd like to actually return to the question of allocation problem. I don't want to drop
Very
that
quick,
issue.
comment,
Yes.
Because we run significantly
Oh,
over time.
all right. I'm sorry. I'll be very quick. An allocation problem presupposes that the ends are commensurable on one hand, and that there's a clear separation between means and ends on the other. Now, sometimes really neither one of those conditions apply. And so, for example, when it comes to work and the idea that work is a form of prayer, there, when we're trading off work and leisure, for example, the means and ends are combined because work is a form of prayer. And therefore, there's no separation between the two. You also have the issue of incommensurability. And basically, sometimes allocation problems are not made at the margin, but they're made from the center. So for example, if prices go up in something, a whole category of goods may drop off from the family's expenditures. And so changes occur at the center rather than the margins, as Hodgson, for example, argues. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I invite Dean Scott for a final word to conclude our session, let me thank our esteemed winner, Tony, for his scholarship, also for his moral commitments that enable us to come together to discuss Cathonomics. Thank you very much, Tony. And to thank each of our distinguished panelists for bringing the wisdom of their traditions and their insights to this discussion tonight. And earlier today, we're very grateful for your presence and for making this such a rich experience for all of us. And of course, to all of you, thank you for being here and for your questions, most of all for your presence. I do want to just say a quick word of gratitude to our host, Mahan. I think I would speak for all of the guests here to say that we have really been touched by your warmth, the hospitality of the Ansari Institute. And Rebecca, Rebecca is here. But you do make us feel that we are returning to a family whenever we come here for an event. So thank you, Mahan and Rebecca and Ansari. And I leave the last word now to Dean Scott, however you want to conclude our session tonight.
So I've been asked just to make a very brief closing remark, and I will begin by thanking Tony and Annett. Is it on? I got it. There are some people in this room, not a lot, who weren't part of the conversation already the last day and more. For those of you who weren't, I was able to kind of bounce in and out just very briefly today. Very rich discussions from all these folks today. And the pieces I could hear were really enriching. So I went away bitter and resentful that I can't be there all the time, because I really would have loved to be there. Tony, so this may have been said already or acknowledged, but I had a memory with Tony that I'll carry with me the rest of my life, a shared experience that Tony really was largely responsible for, that we met at the Vatican, the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences for how many meetings? 10 meetings over about 2 years. So every few months. Did you talk about this at all? A little bit. Anyway, it was a meeting on ethics in action, and Tony really put it all together. And he was convening, helped to convene religious leaders and interlocutors, as well as secular experts on various issues, from human trafficking to ecological change, environment, peace and war. And Tony was absolutely masterful in herding all these cats from all over the world and dealing with, the Pontifical Academy, dealing with is be the appropriate word there on some occasions, and Jeff Sachs in the chair, and it was bloom and buzz and confusion, but Tony was the still center of it, and he had not only the presence to pull it all off, but he also, as you know, has the expertise and the knowledge to comprehend not only the Catholic tradition, but to be very much engaged with other religious traditions. And the fact that you come from your own economic background and training made it all the more invaluable. So it's a long-winded way of saying we really appreciate you, and we're just delighted that you're our honoree this year. Also want to thank all of the panelists who, some of whom have, at least I've met before, and you've been here before, and others I'm meeting for the first time, and you've all been terrific. And again, I wish I could have heard more of what you talked about, but I look forward to whatever written documents and memorials come out from that. I want to thank also, while I have a chance, the Ansari Institute Advisory Board, some of whom are right here, led by Mary McAleese, but for being here and helping move the Institute along and put together outstanding events like this one. And of course, to Mahan and the team. So it's not just Mahan. Charles is there, and Alex is somewhere, and Rebecca, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but we're really very proud of the Ansari Institute and how much it's doing to advance the kind of dialogue and understanding. And the reason I was poking with my last question there is because we have so much to learn from one another. And certainly the Catholic tradition has a lot to be humble about and a lot to learn. And just the responses that you've given to my little irreverent question there displays a depth of riches intellectually and spiritually that we want to continue to draw upon in the months and years ahead. So we have a reception to go to. Is that right, boss?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's go.